And now I would like to invite Professor Lutz Goetzmann. Good morning, Lutz. Good
Morning,
morning and
Patricia.
welcome to our symposium. Thank you so much for being part of our 10th symposium, an important moment. And we are so honored that you are able to speak to us this morning and give us a presentation on the position of the absolute idea in the ethics of psychoanalysis. So I will just introduce you to everyone. So Lutz is an analyst in private practice in Berlin. He's co-founder of the Institute for Philosophy, Psychoanalysis and Cultural Studies, and author of numerous psychoanalytic works, including on psychosomatics and cultural studies. And so your work, your thinking is so important to us today, and we look forward to what you have to say to us. Thank you, Lutz.
Yes, Patricia, thank you for the nice introduction and also for the invitation. And I would like to begin, dear colleagues. The 21st century is characterized by a multitude of crises that can be understood as a system of high-risk, parallel, overlapping, and interconnected situations around the globe. One example is the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The question is how psychoanalysis could position itself in the face of this crisis and catastrophes. What practical implications does this situation have for psychotherapists and psychoanalysts? I would like to briefly introduce you to some aspects of Lacanian psychoanalysis and Hegel's idealistic philosophy to address these thoughts in relation to the topic of today's symposium, freedom and dignity and humanity. In this sense, I will combine Lacan's ideas on the psychic world, structured as a so-called Borromean knot, with Hegel's philosophy of the absolute idea. Here, you see the model of the Borromean knot, which forms the analytic basis for our considerations. You see the biological matter in the three registers of the ideal, of the idea: the real, the unrepresented, the imaginary, the sensual, that is in the form of images, and the symbolic, language, words, signifiers, which is expanded, in my view, by the phenomenal, non-linguistic and atmospheric, the feelings being projected in the external space. Moreover, I will refer here to two core ideas in Hegel's philosophical system. Firstly, Hegel had a dual aspect monism when he described the ideal, the mind, as the ideal side of matter and the matter as the material side of the ideal, of mind. Secondly, Hegel describes the dialectical development of the mind, which starts from simple unconscious sensations and leads to the absolute knowledge that is detached from perceptions. This absolute knowledge, that is of theoretical nature, leads to the so-called absolute idea in the case that it is completed by practice. The absolute idea is only possible when theoretical and practical knowledge, idea and action come together. This process, however, is a circular one. It goes from matter to the absolute theoretical knowledge and returns to matter. In this way, the absolute idea will be established. We can now connect the absolute idea with Lacan's Borromean knot. In this sense, I propose that we speak of the Borromean circle that makes the absolute idea possible. Of course, for us, the connection between absolute and practical knowledge is particularly interesting, namely from the perspective of freedom, dignity, and action. But now I would like to describe the Borromean circle in the light of the absolute idea more in detail. Let us first turn to matter. Matter is nature, from mechanics and physics to the living nature of our bodies. However, matter, including nature as well as the human body, is only conceivable as ideality. Hegelian matter is abstract, pure, predicate-free, without sensory determinations. Only this ideal, this idea, shows the reality of matter. The same thought occurs today in quantum physics. Matter becomes an abstraction formalized in mathematical formulas, as Zizek explains. I come now to the real. It was introduced into psychoanalysis by Jacques Lacan. It is unconscious, unrepresented, and indeterminate. Although it does exist, it is not existent for us, precisely because it is unrepresented. Leclerc answered the question, what is the real, with the following stupendous statement. That which resists, which stubbornly persists, which exists irreducibly, and which, by eluding us, presents itself as pleasure, fear, death, or castration. Hegel already spoke of simple and unconscious sensations, which would refer to the deeper layers of the subjective mind. Some of these real sensations can be translated into the Lacanian imaginary and be determined symbolically, that is, by words. Other real sensations cannot be translated. They remain in a state of lack. But in any case, real sensations are a response to the impact from outside. Thus, an angry face or a seductive voice is first perceived materially at the level of the sensory cells and then transmitted to areas of the brain where the ideal side of the matter imposes as a real sensation, or, as Lacan says, as a thing, or the so-called object A. Within the Borromean knot, the real is complemented by the rings of the imaginary and symbolic. As thoughts with a sensory basis, imaginary contents are visual images. This is Lacan's position. But in my view, they are also sound, taste, smell, and the sense of internal and external touch. Last but not least, the feelings belong to the imaginary. Today, it is possible to put in touch Lacan's imaginary with the cognitive theory of predictive coding. This piece of theory, that may be very valuable for psychological thinking, assumes that we constantly form assumptions about the world outside that is largely hidden from us. Our knowledge is based on a handful of signals that are currently perceived and on experiences we had in the past and remember now. Thus, we do not see, hear, taste, smell, or feel the world as it is, but as we expect it to be. The imaginary is a simulated prediction of how the world could be. Before being defined by words, this imaginary takes on a phenomenal quality. Basically, the register of a phenomenal imaginary may exist already in the prenatal period. For example, as an interplay of the imaginary sense of touch, depth perception, or the sense of balance. As ultrasound images show, children play with the umbilical cord or use the placenta as a kind of pillow. One could say, therefore, that phenomenal thinking begins with touching and feeling the mother's inner world and one's own body. However, such experiences lose their phenomenal quality when they are determined by the symbolic, by language. In the Borromean knot, the symbolic is the third ring. Of course, we know language comes from the other, from the adult, whose words or phrases the child hears from the very beginning of his life. The child learns, for example, that certain people can be associated with the words or signifiers mommy or daddy. In this way, the child can connect the real, which is realized in the imaginary, with words, and then use these words to communicate with others. However, such a complex of imaginary and symbolic thoughts can also be repressed, that is, become unconscious again, as soon as the thoughts are discovered as incompatible with other ideas, for example, those of the superego. Then this gives rise to a repressed, not real unconscious with all neurotic implications, but also with the option of dreams or historical symptoms. But today I don't want to follow this path which opens the fields of neurosis. I will rather turn to the logic of the symbolic register, which takes place in consciousness. The symbolic, insofar as it is language, can be organized within the framework of certain logics, including the logic of judgment and the logic of inference. In the logic of judgment, we distinguish between judgments that make statements about perceptions, perceptual judgments, and judgments that do not refer to perceptions, but rather to other concepts, conceptual judgments. The key point is that the latter, that is a conceptual judgment, leads to something that Hegel called the absolute knowledge. It is a knowledge that is completely detached from perception and that in this sense has emancipated itself from all dependencies outside the system of pure concepts. So, on the one hand, we have judgments that refer to the phenomenal imaginary. Please note, these judgments refer only to the imaginary assumption and simulations. In this sense, they are highly subjective. On the other hand, we have judgments that function exclusively with the symbolic register, being objective. These build up an objective reality. So, we can say that absolute knowledge represents the Hegelian crown of Lacan's symbolic thinking. This form of thinking that thinks nothing but itself is in contrast to the appearance, to the semblance of the imaginary objective. From this point of view, reality is only constituted within the symbolic. The original concept, as Hegel says, because it determines itself, it is, I quote, absolute certainty and opens up the realm of freedom. In this moment, a special type of ego is established. It is the pure self-consciousness, being objective, free, and truly imbued with certainty. Thus, Lacan's subject of the unconscious is negated as well as sublated in the pure self-consciousness of the ego. One can say that the ego of the pure self-consciousness is Lacan's subject of idealism, or, as I propose, the subject of pure consciousness. In this sense, we could differentiate between the subject of the unconscious, being real or repressed, the subject of consciousness, being imaginary, determined by words, and the subject of pure consciousness, being symbolic and without reference to the imaginary. Now that we have dealt with the logical structure of the symbolic, we move on to explain how Hegel's absolute idea could be understood as method, form, content, theoretical or absolute knowledge, and action, practice or practical knowledge. The absolute idea is first and foremost a method. It arises when abstract concepts in the world outside come together through the connection of theory and practice. Only through this connection, the absolute idea or the absolute truth will arise. I quote Hegel, "The absolute idea is first of all the unity of the theoretical and the practical idea, and thus at the same time the unity of the idea of life and the idea of cognition." We can also consider the absolute idea in terms of its content. For Hegel, this content is something like goodness or humanity. I think it may also be freedom or dignity. On the one hand, Hegel refers here to Plato, for whom the goodness, to be good, seems to be the highest idea we can think. On the other hand, Hegel believes that the world was created with a theological goal that the good must be realized in it. To be clear, our world was created to realize the good. In this respect, the good is the highest concept or idea of our thinking. So the absolute idea can be formed in the realization of goodness, dignity, or freedom. These are the highest goods of humanity. But Hegel says that the idea of the highest good cannot be conceived without something that is like evil. Christian authors, such as Augustine, claim, as we know, that the world being created by God was original good, and that the bad state of our world only has arisen because we humans abuse the gift fundamentally. It is the divine gift of freedom. In contrast, nature is for Hegel completely evil, because it is self-centered and ruled by brutal drives, by instincts and irrational impulses. From this view, our history does not have a positive, peaceful beginning. Rather, it starts in a state of wild crudeness, in a state of chaotic instinctuality, as Hegel says. Therefore, Hegel understands the fall as a division between nature and spirit. With this spiritual, we will be able to emerge step by step from our primordial state. Unfortunately, nobody can fail to notice that most people remain determined by nature, by the instincts and drives. Thus, there will remain natural, and in this respect evil. We are evil when we follow our natural will, when we kill or exploit peaceful others, accepting their misfortune or even their death. Surprisingly, the evil must happen, as Hegel claims, because only then, in this problematic case, can it be overcome. The goal of creation is the fulfillment and completion of the absolute idea. Our dialectical path must lead from evil to good, from drive to idea to action, from the natural to the free and pure will. Seen from a psychoanalytic standpoint, the absolute idea encompasses, therefore, the whole Borromean circle of thought and transformation. From the unconscious real to the absolute knowledge, and from the absolute knowledge to practice and action. Here you see the corresponding figure again. I would like to refer to an example from German history that shows how absolute knowledge and action could be combined. To redeem food ration cards, the German Jewish Romanist Victor Klemperer had to walk to downtown Dresden because using public transport was forbidden for Jewish people. On Friday, the 8th of May 1942, he noted the following in his diary. But yesterday, this too. On the Vasa Square, you see here on the slide, two grey-haired ladies, teachers in their 60s, whom I often met in my lectures and presentations. They stop. One of them approaches me with her hand outstretched, and I think, an old listener, and I lift my head. But I don't know her, and she doesn't introduce herself either. She just shakes my hand with a smile and says, "You know why," and walks away before I can say a word. Such demonstrations, dangerous for both parties, are said to occur frequently. The counterpart to the recent. Why are you still alive, you scoundrel? And both of these in Germany, in the middle of the 20th century. Let us understand this spontaneous and intuitive, yet highly risky, life-threatening gesture as a pure ethical act. The two elderly ladies see a professor in downtown Dresden. He is wearing the Jewish star and is thus forbidden from using the tram. Without a doubt, this sight, which is initially conveyed physically, leaves an impression on the real unconscious, as a real sensation which is translated into the imaginary. One of the two women, not the other, now approaches the professor, extends her hand and expresses her solidarity to him, the Jew, in full view of an NS public being extremely anti-Semitic. In principle, she is risking her life. What was going through her mind? One can only speculate. I suspect that she had a notion that pointed towards the independent, objective, absolute idea of goodness. But it does not stop at this thought, that is Hegel's absolute knowledge. Rather, the lady puts her idea of goodness into action. She approaches the humiliated man and extends her hand to him. Just in this moment, the absolute idea is completed. Through practice, through action. to the combination of the idea of goodness and the action on the square. In Seminar 7, Lacan says that ethical thought is at the center of our work as analysts. But his ethics consists solely in the question, have you acted in conformity with the desire that is in you? Thus, one can say that Lacan relates action to desire. In his later writings, Lacan shifts the emphasis from the question of acting in accordance with desire to the question of speaking, to the ethics of speaking well. Now, ethical responsibility refers to one speaking that has a good and vivid contact with the unconscious. However, from my view, the crucial point is not only that we know our desire and keep it alive, but that we have the choice to follow it or not, by speaking and by acting. In this case, it would be our free decision to invoke the highest good, connecting with our actions. It is our free decision, regardless of whether someone sits behind the couch listening to the parents' words or steps out onto the street, if it is not too dangerous to go out. Of course, the goal of our desire could also lie in the destruction of the earth, as it is the case with current US policy, which promotes the fossil industry and fights against renewable energies. The ethics of a Donald Trump or Vladimir Putin lie in the accumulation of wealth and power at the price of destroying the existence of other beings. I suspect they know that the idea of the good exists, regardless of whether they have read Plato, Hegel, or Kant. But they refuse to connect their actions with the highest good and follow rather their desires, which function more within the context of the natural will, subjugating the other without regard for the consequences. This is, as Lacan says, the flip side of Kant's categorical imperative. It is the dark desire of someone like the Marquis de Sade. This morning, today, an analyst spoke about the political situation and how Trump and Putin want to strike a big deal to exploit jointly oil and coal reserves. This is what I mean by a natural will. My patient was deeply worried that the war in Ukraine would only be the beginning of more global conflicts, the fight for water, food, energy, and so on. The great alternative, however, is that desire is directed toward the highest good, towards an idea that we can put into practice, not solely based on the superego, but through insight that we are responsible for all beings, humans, animals, or plants living on this earth. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Lutz, for this very powerful and deeply thought through presentation which you have given to us. I have a sense of the hours that you have spent formulating these thoughts, working from the ideas of Hegel and Lacan particularly, and that they are, it's a rich nourishment to you in your work. And now you've given it to us as a rich nourishment to this symposium, and especially at this time of war. And I'm particularly touched by this this moment from history where, as you said, there was actually at one level a very human encounter in the
Yes.
square, a very, very human encounter. Um, the woman saw Klemperer
Yes.
and took the decision to approach him, took the decision to extend her hand and take his hand, knowing the danger, knowing the risk that it was. At one level, it was a simple human act of warmth and welcome and contact. But at another level, it was a very dangerous thing to do. And yet she took that step. And we are all able to take those kinds of steps. We are all of us here today, all of us able to take those kinds of human steps to move humanity in the direction of the good and not follow the desire which she might have had to avoid him. To think, no, this is too dangerous. I'm not going to go and approach him. I'll walk the other way. But she didn't do that. She took the risk, and it's an example for all of us to be able to do that. And I completely agree with your analysis in terms of Trump and Putin. That the difficulty is that they are following their desires, and they are not able anyway at the moment, it seems, to be able to work for the greater good and use the positions that they have in society to be able to work to the greater good. But in Ukraine, we see something different. We see the ways in which actually Zelensky in power and those and other people in power in the Ukrainian society are working for good, even within the context of the war. And it's such a powerful example to us as humanity.
Yes, thank you very much for the feedback. I think Putin and Trump, I suppose they would be able, but they have another choice.
Yes, yes. And do you have a sense of how they could change that choice? Because I look at them and think, how could you begin to behave differently and use the authority that you have in a different way? Do you have a sense of that? What is the thing that can change them from following their desire?
I have two answers. The first answer is by culture,
Yes,
by the work of culture. That is the answer of Freud.
yes,
Maybe that the
that's the
work
answer.
of
Yes,
culture, the work of civilization,
exactly.
could change something in society.
Yes,
We a little bit like in Germany, in Western Germany, after the Second World War. There
yes,
was a big influence by schools and education.
yes.
And I was also someone who had a profit from this tendency.
Oh,
But the other answer is more difficult. Hegel says it is a circle.
yes.
So we go back to the evil. And he says we need the evil to develop the good, the idea of goodness. This Leonetic idea would say that we need Putin and Trump
Oh,
to develop the absolute idea.
oh,
I'm not sure if Hegel is right, but I refer his side, his view on history, that the evil Putin and Trump, I think, are necessary that we can develop the absolute idea of goodness.
oh.
That's the second answer, the Hegelian
Yeah.
answer. The first answer was the Freudian answer.
Yes, yes. The first answer is the Freudian answer.
Yes,
And
the more synthetic.
okay. And the second answer is much more challenging, and it puts me in mind of Jung and the shadow. And
Yes,
there's some similarity and parallel in those ideas.
yes,
But it's a complicated and a challenging idea that comes from Hegel there.
yes,
Yes.
yes.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Professor Lutz,
Thank you for listening. Thank you.
for the powerful presentation that you've given to us this morning. We are very much in your debt in giving us your wisdom, your expertise, your time today. Thank you so much for being part of our 10th Symposium.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.